Soon, humanity will stop building intelligence and start growing it. In February 2026, researchers at UC Santa Cruz published a paper in Cell Reports that sounds like it was pulled from science fiction. They grew brain organoids, tiny clusters of neurons derived from mouse stem cells, placed them on a specialized chip, and then asked those neurons to solve a classic engineering problem called the cart pole task. Imagine holding a ruler vertically in the palm of your hand. You have to keep adjusting, constantly correcting, reacting to the tilt. That's the cart pole problem. It's one of the first things we teach robots. Every human infant has to solve a version of this just to learn how to stand up. Here's the thing. The organoid had no eyes, no hands, no body at all. It received electrical signals encoding the angle of a virtual pole. It sent back electrical spikes that the researchers translated into force applied to a virtual cart. And over hundreds of episodes, coached by a reinforcement learning algorithm that acted like a patient trainer saying, "Not quite, try adjusting here," the organoid improved. Its success rate jumped from 4.5% under random training to 46% under adaptive coaching. A pea-sized piece of tissue grown in a lab learned to play a video game. It forgot everything after a 45-minute rest. We'll come back to that forgetting because it matters more than you'd think. And we'll come back to that coaching algorithm too, because the relationship between the biological tissue and the artificial trainer is one of the strangest partnerships in the history of science. Both of those threads are going to collide later. But first, let me take you somewhere much older. Let's imagine the entire history of computation as a single story about a caveman who discovers electricity. The first thing the caveman notices is that electricity can be on or off. That's it. One state or another, 1 or 0. And from that single primitive observation, everything else follows. Because if you can represent two states, you can store information. If you can store information, you can encode patterns. And if you wire switches together in the right arrangements, electricity flowing through them can perform logic. And or not. That's the first real unlock. Not electricity itself, but the realization that on and off could mean true and false. Logic circuits gave us arithmetic. Arithmetic gave us general computation. Vacuum tubes shrank into transistors. Transistors multiplied into millions on a chip, then billions. Computation went from filling a room to fitting in your pocket. And then machines got connected. Single computers became networks. Networks became data centers. Data centers became the cloud. Suddenly you didn't have one brain, you had warehouses of silicon brains humming in concert. But here's what's worth sitting with for a moment. None of that, not the transistors, not the cloud, not the sheer brute force of it, is what gave us artificial intelligence. The unlock for AI was something quieter. Instead of programming rules, instead of telling a machine, if A happens, do B, someone asked a different question. What if we let the machine adjust itself? Neural networks. Give the system a billion examples. Let it tune its own internal parameters until its outputs match the pattern. The machine rewires itself through optimization. It learns statistical structure from data. Electricity gave us switching. Transistors gave us scale. The cloud gave us parallelism. And optimization gave us learning. That last step, machines modifying their own internal weights based on error, is the true doorway. Everything before it was infrastructure. And yet, here we are in 2026, and there's still a chorus of voices saying large language models aren't really thinking. It's just predicting the next word. It's the Wizard of Oz, a statistical parrot. Let me introduce you to an idea about why that skepticism is so persistent and why it might actually be a feature of our biology rather than a flaw in our reasoning. There's a concept in evolutionary psychology sometimes called the negativity bias, and it runs deep. The organisms that survived weren't the optimists. They weren't the ones who saw a new berry and thought, "That looks delicious, let me try it." The ones who passed on their genes were the ones who watched another animal eat it first. Caution was the winning strategy for most of evolutionary history. If you assume the rustling in the bushes is a predator and you're wrong, you lose nothing. If you assume it's the wind and you're wrong, you lose everything. That asymmetry shaped us. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's work on loss aversion demonstrated that losses loom roughly twice as large as equivalent gains in human decision-making. We're wired to weigh the downside more heavily than the upside. It's not stupidity, it's inheritance. So when someone encounters a chatbot that writes poetry and code and legal briefs, the ancient circuitry whispers, "Be careful, this might be the berry." The instinct is to downplay, to find the seam in the magic trick, It's just statistics. It doesn't understand. It's pattern matching. And maybe some of that caution is warranted, but here's the thing about the present moment that makes the old instinct misleading. We might be living in one of the rare eras where optimism is the edge, where the person who sees what's possible before it's proven has the advantage. Evolution hasn't caught up to that yet. Imagine you were born in 1920. You watch vacuum tubes fill a room. Someone tells you that one day, machines built from these glowing glass bulbs will write symphonies and diagnose cancer. You would probably laugh. Not because it's impossible, but because the intermediate steps are invisible to you. We may be living inside someone else's invisible intermediate steps. In 1950, Alan Turing proposed what we now call the Turing test. He did not ask whether machines could be conscious. He asked whether machines could convincingly imitate human conversation. Notice the shift. He reframed intelligence from inner experience to outward behavior. Large language models today are often criticized as just predicting the next word, which is technically true, but so is saying the heart is just pumping blood. The question is not whether it predicts the next word. The question is what emerges when prediction operates at planetary scale. We see something similar in neuroscience called predictive processing theory. The brain may function as a prediction engine, constantly minimizing error between expectation and sensory input. If that is true, then just prediction might be closer to cognition than it first appears. For most of human history, the idea of artificial general intelligence was conceivable. You could imagine it in principle the moment someone realized that reasoning could be broken into formal rules, and those rules could be mechanized. The philosophical door was open the instant logic, mathematics, and machinery were unified. Alan Turing saw it. Ada Lovelace arguably saw it before him. But conceivable and achievable are separated by an enormous gap. For decades, AGI lived in the same category as faster than light travel. Theoretically interesting, practically out of reach. What's changed is not that the destination moved closer. What's changed is that the road is now paved. Large language models, reinforcement learning, transformer architectures, scaling laws, these aren't detours or dead ends. They're mile markers on a path that appears to continue in the same direction. The gap between where we are and where general intelligence might live is no longer a canyon you have to leap across. It looks more like a highway you have to drive down. You might be able to get there by doing more of what's already working, more compute, more data, more refined architectures, more of the same. And if more of the same could potentially get us there, then the interesting question isn't really about the road we can see, it's about the roads we haven't imagined yet. This is where the brain organoid story comes back in and where those two threads reconnect. Remember the forgetting? The organoids lost their training after 45 minutes of rest. David Hausler, one of the lead researchers, suggested that more complex organoids, perhaps grown to include multiple brain regions involved in animal learning, might be needed to develop something resembling long-term memory. Now hold that thought alongside the coaching algorithm. The organoid did not learn alone. It learned because an artificial reinforcement learning system was guiding it, choosing which neurons to stimulate, deciding when to intervene. A silicon intelligence training, a biological one. What you're seeing is a feedback loop between two fundamentally different kinds of computation. One made of code, one made of cells, and neither one, on its own, achieved what they achieved together. But the forgetting raises a deeper question. Where exactly is memory stored? To explore that, let me introduce a completely different line of research, one that sounds almost mythological at first. Planarian flatworms are small, simple organisms with relatively primitive nervous systems. Scientists have long studied them because of one extraordinary ability. If you cut a planarian in half, each half can regenerate into a complete worm. In experiments first conducted in the mid-20th century and later revisited with tighter controls, researchers trained planarians to associate a flash of light with a mild electric shock. Over time, the worms learned to respond to the light alone. Then the scientists did something almost unbelievable. They cut the worms in half. Each half regenerated into a full worm. When tested again, the regenerated worms reacquired the learned behavior faster than completely untrained worms. The implication was not mystical, it was structural. It suggested that memory might not be stored exclusively in centralized brain tissue. Some component of the learned pattern appeared to survive dramatic physical restructuring. Later work in regenerative biology pointed toward distributed bioelectric signaling across tissues as part of the mechanism. In other words, memory may not be a static file stored in one location. It may be a dynamic pattern embedded across an entire system. The lab-grown tissue forgot after 45 minutes. That suggests its plasticity was short-term, but the planarian experiments suggest that biological systems can sometimes preserve learned patterns even when their physical architecture is radically altered. What we may be seeing are layers of biological computation, short-term adaptive tuning in the organoid, longer-term distributed encoding in regenerative organisms, and suddenly the question shifts. If memory and learning are patterns distributed across tissue rather than files stored in one place, then intelligence starts to look less like a machine with a hard drive and more like a field of activity that stabilizes itself over time, which makes the organoid forgetting even more interesting, because it hints that what may be missing is not intelligence itself, it may be architectural complexity. And that brings us back to hybrid systems. We can see this principle of preserving pattern over material reflected in human culture as well. Consider the Japanese tradition of Shikinen Sengu, the ritual rebuilding of the Isegran shrine every 20 years. The community reconstructs the shrine from entirely new timber. Once the new structure is complete, the old one is dismantled. Physically, the wood is replaced, yet the shrine is considered ancient and continuous. The function of this ritual is not about preserving lumber, it is about preserving knowledge, the architectural techniques, the craftsmanship, the coordination between generations. The continuity lives in the pattern, in the transmitted structure of action, not in the atoms of the building. The shrine persists because the information persists. Intelligence may work the same way. Does it matter if the pattern runs on silicon, ancient timber, or lab-grown neural tissue? Or is continuity defined by the preservation and refinement of structure rather than substance? If intelligence is a pattern that can survive the replacement of its physical substrate, then silicon versus biology might be the wrong debate altogether. What if the things that carry us past the threshold of general intelligence aren't just bigger models and more data? What if some of the crucial advances come from directions we haven't conceived of? Brain-computer interfaces are one possibility. Hybrid biological silicon systems are another. New discoveries in physics or mathematics that AI itself might help us find. There's a wonderful recursion hiding in that idea. The tool we're building might discover the principles that make it fundamentally better. Consider this. When AlphaFold solved the protein folding problem in 2020, it didn't just demonstrate that AI could do biology, it gave biologists a tool that accelerated everything downstream. Suddenly, research questions that would have taken years could be explored in days. The AI didn't replace the scientist, it changed the speed of science itself. Now extrapolate that, not as a prediction, but as a thought experiment. What happens when AI systems start contributing not just to applied problems, but to foundational ones, to the mathematics of learning itself, to the physics of computation, to questions about consciousness and information theory that we've been circling for decades? The path to something beyond current artificial intelligence might not run through silicon alone. It might run through organoids, through quantum computing, through discoveries in neuroscience that change how we understand what learning even is, through some insight so unexpected that it would sound absurd if you tried to describe it today. Keith Hengen, a neuroscientist at Washington University who reviewed the organoid research, put it in terms that should give you pause. He said the capacity for adaptive computation appears to be intrinsic to cortical tissue itself, not something added by dopamine or experience or a body, intrinsic, baked in. If the raw material of learning is just there in any sufficiently organized neural tissue, then we've been thinking about the problem backwards. We've been asking, how do we build something smart enough to think, when the question might be, how do we stop getting in the way of something that already wants to learn? So here's where we are. The road we can see, the one paved with scaling laws and transformer architectures, already stretches further than most skeptics are comfortable admitting. More of the same might be enough. That alone should reframe the conversation. But the road we can't see, the one being cleared by brain organoids and hybrid computation and discoveries we haven't made yet, that road is what should really reshape how you think about what's coming. If you're still skeptical that artificial general intelligence is approaching, consider that the skepticism itself might be the old wiring talking, the negativity bias, the instinct to wait and watch someone else eat the berry. There was a time when that instinct kept us alive. But there's something different about this moment, something that might reward those who look at what's forming on the horizon and allow themselves to take it seriously. A clump of neurons in a dish, with no eyes, no hands, no desire to succeed, learned to balance a pole because a machine coached it with electrical whispers. That partnership, clumsy and fragile and prone to forgetting, might be the earliest murmur of something we don't have a name for yet. The brain that grew itself didn't know it was learning. The machine that coached it didn't know it was teaching. And somewhere in the space between those two kinds of not knowing, something new is starting to take shape. We might want to pay attention to it.